I would like to welcome River Garza and Joel Garcia from the Native community for the acknowledgement of the land and some information on the work of the Native community around homelessness.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Joel Garcia. I'm an artist here. And I mean, it's interesting for me being here because the history of my family coming to Los Angeles is very much rooted on the street of Broadway. My uncle had a jewelry shop on 5th and Broadway for a long time. I, as a kid, took the bus here to East LA. I grew up in the projects over there. So like my history of like the arrival of my family is this street here. And when we talk about, or when I talk about like Native communities in LA, my family, part of my family comes from Mexico, but on my mom's side, my grandmother ended up over there by forced deportation. She was born in the U.S. Her family is native to, the area of Detroit. So that back and forth, right, of people and then how you get changed or reclassified from being Native American to Latino, then to Hispanic, and all these different labels, right, that ultimately serve to disconnect us from our communities. So the Native American Indian Commission, which is a city-county commission, is doing a lot of work to really untangle those labels, to really be able to capture every individual that's homeless, that's Native American or Alaskan Indian, or even what those labels encompass, right? Some of these labels are dictated by federal acknowledgements, others by county acknowledgements, others by city ordinances. So it's also a push on like how, our indigeneity has also been reclassified. So last week, the Board of Supervisors approved a motion that was brought to them by the Native American Indian Commission to do a survey of the homeless community, or like I like to say, unsheltered community, to really see who's out there. How do we reconnect these folks with their families, with their tribal nations? Because it's one thing to know who they are, know where they're at, but how do we use that data to best serve them? How do we use that data to create culturally responsive strategies to bring these people back into our cultural practices, right? How do we work with them on a day-to-day basis? As indigenous folks, I think our livability isn't by living in a box. We're communal people. We're doing things. We create our own families as well because of everything this country has done. So in that sense, are we also working with our homeless population in the same way of reconnecting these strands of community, of culture, of identity? So that's the work that the commission is doing. And we'll share with the Goethe-Institut how to plug in. This is very new. Like I said, this was approved last week. So collecting this data is important, but then also how do we operationalize this so that it best serves our community, and how do we move that upstream to all the different departments within the county. So we'll have updates as things go along. They're going to develop a website and some toolkits. So like I said, it's all very much new, but we wanted to share that with folks so that, we're bringing that perspective to this conversation as well.
Mayowen, River Takwi Garza. Hello everyone, my name is River Takwi Garza. I am an artist, painter, and member of the Tonga community. So I am from the land, who are the indigenous people of Los Angeles. And it's really an honor to be up here today and connect the work that we're doing from my tribal community to the work that you're doing as well. So as the indigenous people from LA, we were the first people to experience homelessness, displacement, right? What does that look like in a historical context? What does that look like now? In the past, there's an important village site rested right here on the Los Angeles River that runs adjacent to the city. Also Yangna, which is an important village site for a lot of our community. And with the establishment of the city, our people got displaced with that. Los Angeles City Hall, Olvera Street, in the past, it's not really talked about, but at one point in time, it was the epicenter for the slave trade of Native American people, our tribe. So, displacement also coincides with incarceration. How has that affected our people? How has that affected other populations that have come to the city? How do we rectify these problems, right? What does that look like moving forward? And as a community now, look at the place. It's extreme. The city is extremely urbanized. How are people continue to make connections to the land, connections with other people, and maintain a sense of culture in place, right, while still being physically displaced from our home. Like myself, I grew up in the South Bay. I grew up in Gardena. The South Bay is changing a lot. My mom family recently got displaced from the area. It's changing because of the stadium ramps and all of that. So how does that look like, right? How does that affect Native people that grew up in the city now? Tonga folks. A lot of my community members can't necessarily afford to live in the city. Like my family traditionally comes from the west side of the Venice area. Like that has changed drastically. Gentrification, what does that look like for our community? Our people that we're tied to certain places since time immemorial, right? Like, it's one thing to call home, to form a home, but also have home intergeneration through time. What does that look like? So it's really important, and I'm glad to be up here today.
And more than anything, this is also like an invitation to connect with the folks doing this work. Like I said, I'm an artist. I don't do this work on a day-to-day basis. But as an artist, we do carry messages. So that's the message that we come here with, of a welcome to Yangna, to Tonga territory, but also an invitation to engage with folks and to engage with the work of the commission. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Belpete. I wanted to welcome you to the Skid Row History Museum and Archive. And our current show is about dogs and housing, as you can see. And you can play with the soundscape if you want, that Henry Apodaca and Helen Kim created. So the Skid Row History Museum and Archive is a big name, but it's part of an even bigger international conglomerate known as the Los Angeles Poverty Department, which is an arts group for people in Skid Row. And the purpose was couple-fold. One is to get the real deal out to Normalville, which means sort of an unmediated view of what's going on, and also to create community in Skid Row. The museum came about because, speaking of displacement, because people would like to say, the non-real deal, the outside view is like, oh, there's nothing in Skid Row, there's no history, therefore let's move everyone to the desert and build this thing up, And if out the window is Bunker Hill, which was a residential community, which was completely, if we lived in Kentucky, we'd say mountaintop removal, and then completely corporatized, right? After the success of that, they wanted to do the same thing with everything east of here. And some really smart activists who lived and worked in Skid Row were able to prevent that, and that's the only reason Skid Row has existed. And the only reason it's continued to exist is, again, the ongoing history of activism coming from the neighborhood. So it's a really special place because it's and so anyway, I want to thank the Goethe-Institut for putting this together and for and inviting us in on it. And now, what happens next, Lena? Is it time for? Okay. She's going to tell us what happens next.
Thank you so much, John and River and Joel. My name is Lien Heinreich-Silemme. I'm the director of the Goethe-Institut, the German Cultural Center. And we are an organization that has actually 159 offices worldwide. Our work is cultural exchange. And what's really important for us is the local connection. So we are only good in our work if we engage with local partners and we work with issues that are important in the cities or spaces where we are. Of course, housing and the housing question, housing precarity, homelessness is a very urgent and important issue in Los Angeles, and we do recognize that it needs local solutions, but at the same time we think that it's a global question that could benefit from international engagement, which is how this project came about. So I'm very happy to welcome you to Worlds of Homelessness here today, which we are hoping will create a platform for interdisciplinary and international engagement with the topic of homelessness or houselessness and its many connections such as inequality, gentrification, migration, racism. Over the next days, we will see a number of local and international artists, architects, scholars, activists come together to share ideas, thoughts, and to present their work. The event series that has music, film, discussions will culminate with a wonderful festival for all Skid Row artists, which is in its 10th year and organized by the equally wonderful LA Poverty Department. So I would like to thank all the partners who made this project possible, because it wouldn't have existed with the wonderful people we have been working with. Of course, John, Mel Pete, and Henrietta Browers from this amazing organization. Please give a round of applause to them. This project would have really not existed without you. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your giving us your insight and your support and your connections to this great Skid Row community. And it's really humbling to see the work you have done here for over 30 years. So thank you so much for engaging with us on this project. Then we have Amanda Vincelli and Michael Holt from Naval. That's a collectively driven cultural space in downtown LA, where we will be tomorrow. They also have been sitting with us long discussions to think about how to particularly discuss the questions around artist engagement and homelessness. Then Hernan Diaz Alonso and Eric Ganuyo from SciArc, the Architecture School and Downtown Arts District, where we will be on Thursday, who are willing to engage their students on a social issue, such as homelessness, as part of their curriculum. Then we have Nikolai Blaumer, who's with us here tonight from the Thomas Mann House, the program director. The Thomas Mann House is a residency space in the former home of the German writer and exile Thomas Mann, and Nikolai has been a supporter and a partner of this project from the very beginning. So thank you so much for believing in this connection and for bringing such wonderful residents who are engaging in topics like gentrification, working homeless, all of these important issues, and bringing them to this project. So please give a round of applause to Nikolai. Then I would like to thank Ananya Roy and Marisa Lemorande from the Institute of Inequality and Democracy at UCLA Luskin for their support of the project, for teaching us so much as well through your Housing Justice and Unequal Cities Network, and of course Ananya for being a speaker today. And last but not least, I would like to thank my team who made this all possible in terms of organization and running this enterprise over the next days. So that's Dan Chaffee, Simone Meyer, Stefan Klo, Steffi Krause, Bilen Frey, and Luzine Reinsch. So if we can have a round of applause for them. So before I introduce the discussion today, I wanted to just encourage you all to stay, because after the discussion we have a little reception and we have a wonderful music performance by the LA Playmakers that were founded 5 years ago by Joseph Warren and Stan Watson. They were all members of the praise and worship team at Skid Row's Central City Church of Nazarene. They are all accomplished musicians, and embody the creative spirit that persists in the Skid Row community. They will open the Worlds of Homelessness project today, and they will close out the 10th Festival for All Skid Row Artists on Sunday. So you're welcome to enjoy them twice. And now I would like to introduce the moderator for the discussion today. Catherine Wagley is an art critic and journalist based in Los Angeles. She is a contributing editor for the art journal MoMAs and Contemporary Art Review Los Angeles, CALA. She served as an art critic for the LA Weekly from 2011 to 2017 and contributes to ArtNet News, Art News, Hyperallergic, the LA Times, and The Land, among other publications. She's a recent recipient of the Rapkin Prize for Art Journalism. Her current work often focuses on issues of obscurity. How do we pull stories from the margins of different art worlds without forcing them to fit the mainstream narrative we already know how to tell? Additionally, her reporting in Los Angeles frequently explores the relationships between the art world, gentrification, and urban geography. Please welcome Catherine Wagley.
Thank you. And now I'm going to introduce the panel. So part of the reason that I was excited to do this is that this conference, these 4 days of events, is about bringing together different voices, people who have who all have deep knowledge about homelessness and housing precarity, but some people have that deep knowledge from lived experience. And some people have it through research, and some people have it through advocacy, and I thought it was really exciting to be part of helping all those voices come together, and for us to, figure out how we all talk to each other about these things, how we talk about these things together, how we use our different knowledge bases and backgrounds to, solve these problems and ask these questions that are, as Leanne pointed out, really urgent right now. And also, I was really excited to do it in this space, because this space, the Skid Row History Museum, assumes that Skid Row has an active history that is, full of activism, and that the tellers of that history, who are people who live on Skid Row or who have been part of the Skid Row community for a long time, have the knowledge to narrate that history, and their knowledge should be respected. And I think that that's really important, because so often in the way we narrate Skid Row, we treat it as a problem. And that's something that happens not just with Skid Row, but with lots of other neighborhoods that are changing right now. I mean, it was something that was really interesting when I started researching the activism against gentrification in Boyle Heights, to realize that some of the things that spurred some of those protests were actually like style section articles and magazine articles that treated Boyle Heights as if it wasn't a real place, or that called it a no man's land, that those narratives are really important. So tonight our job is this panel is called Framing the Issue, homelessness and its many related themes, and I will make a gesture toward that, but I'm sure throughout the next few days there'll be lots of ripples about what we talk about tonight. But tonight, part of what we'll talk about is even that term homelessness, like whether that's what it means to use that, what its ramifications are, what it conveys, and whether or not there are other terms that are used elsewhere in the world and that we can use, or that are already being used, among many other things. So we're going to have a few presentations by our panelists, and then we'll have a group discussion amongst us, but then also amongst all of us. And I'm going to avoid bombarding you with bios right now, I'm just going to pop up between each participant and tell you who they are. But our first speaker tonight is Ananya Roy, who was mentioned by Leanne a minute ago. And she is a professor of urban planning, social welfare, and geography, and the inaugural director of the Institute on Inequality and Democracy at UCLA Luskin. She holds the Meyer and Renee Luskin Chair in Inequality and Democracy. Her research and scholarship has a determined focus on poverty and inequality, and seeks to build power for marginalized communities. Her current research is concerned with racial banishment, or the expulsion of working-class communities from cities such as Los Angeles to the far peripheries of urban life. Ananya is the recipient of several awards, including the Paul Davidoff Award, which recognizes scholarship that advances social justice, for her 2010 book, Poverty Capital, Microfinance in the Making of Development. She currently leads a global research network on housing justice in unequal cities, funded by the National Science Foundation.
Good evening, everyone. It is such an honor to be in the space and history of the LA Poverty Department. And a big thank you to the Goethe-Institut for organizing this series of events and for inviting the Institute to be a part of it. So, as you can tell from my title slide, I'm going to talk about a set of processes that over the last few years I've come to call racial banishment. And I'm going to do this by trying to focus on the various ways in which in Los Angeles, but in cities across the United States, we are seeing what I would argue is a systematic unhousing of people. And I'm going to focus on the mechanisms of criminalization and unhousing that make up racial banishment. And I'm going to talk about this as an emerging geography of racial segregation, a renewed geography of racial segregation, but I also want us to think about it in the long history of the forced removal of people of color in Los Angeles that, of course, begins with the dispossession of the Tonga people. In doing so, I want to acknowledge that the term racial banishment is used by many interlocutors, including someone who has been a generous teacher to me in Los Angeles, Pete White at the LA Community Action Network. And when Pete White talks about banishment, he says, look, I don't use the term displacement because displacement suggests that there is some other place to which one can go. Banishment is when there is no place left to go. And sometimes Pete will add, except jail or death. So that is what I want us to think about today. Earlier this year, the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, in order to express his great concern about houselessness, visited an unhoused woman, Crushow, who lives in a dirt embankment in North Hollywood. Accompanied by outreach workers who were handing out information. Thank you. Thank you so much. Accompanied by outreach workers who handed out information to the unhoused about city services, the mayor stated the following. One of the things that's kind of magical as mayor is that sometimes I can make the difference of whether somebody will say, today's the day I'll actually come off the streets. Because really, this is a matter of choice. A few hours after the visit, one of the journalists happened to return to the embankment. City workers were conducting a sweep, sweeping up and destroying the personal property of embankment residents. This included the shopping carts that belonged to Crushow, which contained her ID, medicine, cell phone, food, and clothes. She said, everything I own is gone again. Crusho's story is not an anomaly. The city of Los Angeles, as you all know well, deploys vast public resources to systematically confiscate and destroy the personal property of the unhoused. It is estimated that in 2019, the city will spend $30 million on these sweeps alone. So as income inequality reaches new heights in the United States, so cities such as Los Angeles manifest such inequality. So on the one hand, not very far from where I teach at UCLA, in the hills of Bel Air, is the country's most expensive home that will go on the market later this year. Any guesses for how much? For $500 million. It's called The One. And also, of course, right here where we are today, the unhoused create their own forms of home, often under conditions of fragility and precarity. And they do so under conditions of constant criminalization. This is a very famous image that appeared in Mike Davis's book, City of Quartz. Quite a bit of it was about, of course, Bunker Hill and that redevelopment. So we all know that the story is that of rising houselessness, but what I want to emphasize, of course, that the crisis of the unhoused is not only a crisis of housing and shelter, it is a crisis today of life and death in Los Angeles. The average life expectancy of an unhoused woman in Los Angeles today is 48 years. The average life expectancy of an unhoused man in Los Angeles today is 51 years. Now, of course, we have to situate such numbers in the broader context of inequality and housing precarity in the United States, and consider how houselessness is being produced and reproduced. I'm sure you all remember the Great Recession of 2007-2009 and the housing crisis that accompanied it. The most visible face of that housing crisis was foreclosures. These foreclosures were in turn set into motion by financial deregulation and the massive expansion of subprime lending by big banks. Racial ethnic minority households, once redlined and excluded from housing finance, were now flooded with mortgages, except that this was a form of what many scholars have called predatory inclusion. These households, notably African American and Latino households, lost billions in intergenerational wealth as a part of the foreclosure catastrophe that followed. The overall impact on the so-called middle class has been decisive. The American dream of home ownership has been gutted. What I want to argue, and the work that we've been doing at UCLA, focuses on today's housing crisis and how today's housing crisis takes a different form. I'm going to borrow here on data drawn from one of our key research and community partners, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, based first in San Francisco and now also in Los Angeles and New York. So this is a city that I lived in for many, many years, the city of Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area. And what you will see is that while foreclosures have slowed down, Oakland, like many cities in the country, is in the midst of what is being called an evictions epidemic, with evictions churning through cities and particularly impacting working class communities of color. These evictions are starkly racialized. So again, data from the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and the work they do with the Eviction Defense Collaborative in the San Francisco Bay Area shows the ways in which African American families are disproportionately affected by evictions. One of the questions that I'm obsessed with as a scholar and as someone who's done quite a bit of her research in cities of the so-called Global South is that we know very little in the context of the US as to where the evicted are going. I call them the disappeared. They are erased from our records and archives. There's very little research that systematically follows the evicted and tells us about these geographies of displacement and banishment. What we know is that where they're going is most likely what I'm calling the far peripheries of urban life. The parts of metropolitan regions for which we perhaps don't even have the analytical and political vocabulary. So this is data from a wonderful research advocacy organization in the Bay Area called PolicyLink. And what it tells us that in the Bay Area, a family of two with two minimum wage workers earning full-time, and that you know is already rare, is able to afford rent in only 5% of the Bay Area's neighborhoods, which are the areas in orange, which are the far, far peripheries of urban life. Commuting in from these areas is about 3 hours each way. For the LA folks, what would be the equivalent in LA? Where are people being pushed to? They're being pushed to the desert, right? To Lancaster and Palmdale, right? To the Antelope Valley, where they're facing a new round of evictions, to the Inland Empire, and so forth. Now, once again, these rent burdens, as they are called, are starkly structured by race. So this is from the same report by PolicyLink. And what you see here is the ways in which Black, Latino, and Native American families have a much higher rent burden than white households. So I'd like us to think about this as processes of resegregation. I should say in academic worlds, in journalistic worlds, in policy worlds, there are many terms used to talk about these processes. The suburbanization of poverty, poverty deconcentration, the one that I really dislike, residential mobility, right? It's resegregation, it's racial banishment. Now I want to note that these processes of banishment are deeply entangled with processes of global financialization. And the processes of global financialization involve many of the culprits who were involved in the foreclosure crisis, but are now doing something slightly different. And this is emerging research. So it seems that the Wall Street entities that were involved in the foreclosure crisis, perhaps the most notorious of these is Blackstone, right? They have returned, and what they've been doing is that they are buying up foreclosed single-family homes, turning this into a new rental housing stock, but in the last few years, securitizing this ownership such that these single-family rental homes can become a new asset class for speculation by Wall Street. This is sort of the big picture story, one in which long histories of racial segregation combine with predatory financialization to produce a perfect storm of housing precarity. What I'm particularly interested in is also the processes that happen on the ground. What can be understood as the deepening criminalization of poverty, especially in Los Angeles. I would argue that Los Angeles is well on its way of earning the dubious distinction of being the meanest city in the United States. Our city council every day finds a new way of criminalizing poverty. So I see this criminalization of poverty as producing illegality, as a spatial illegalization of people. I see it as the legal production of illegality, which is a term I'm borrowing from border studies scholar Nicholas de Genova, who studies immigration and looks at how certain groups of immigrants are rendered illegal through immigration law, how they are rendered deportable, how they are rendered disposable. I look in my current research at municipal ordinances in cities such as Los Angeles, and I'm interested in how municipal ordinances create spatial illegalization, and they render, in particular, houselessness as a state of being illegal. So in Los Angeles, the ordinance behind the sweeps that destroyed Crushow's belongings, once again, is LAMC 5611, which limits the ownership of personal property by an unhoused person to a 60-gallon trash bag, the dimensions of the trash bags used by the city's sanitation department, and authorizes a whole range of city workers to seize and destroy so-called excess property. In this settler colonial country devoted to private property, we have to ask, is there another category of people who are thus denied the ability to own property? In addition, the ordinance criminalizes any effort by the unhoused to resist such destruction or to even hold on to property that has been tagged for destruction. In San Francisco, where similar forms of state-organized violence are at work, a collaboration between the Coalition on Homelessness and artists is a poignantly beautiful and powerful project called Stolen Belonging, which frames the city as thief. And I encourage you to go to the Stolen Belonging website and see their coverage of some of these sweeps. So I want to argue that what is at stake here are foundational questions about property and personhood. Who is allowed to be a full person? Who is allowed to have property rights? In a well-known essay written quite a few years ago, legal scholar Jane Barron talked about the condition of houselessness in the United States as not a condition of poverty. She said it's a unique legal and social category that she called no property. And she argued that in this country committed to what I've called propertied citizenship, being no property is a problem. That in fact today the unhoused in Los Angeles are unable to claim the constitutional protections to property and personhood that the property can take for granted. And here I'm drawing very much on the work of someone who is one of my heroes in Los Angeles, Shayla Myers with the Legal Aid Foundation of LA, and the landmark lawsuits she has been filing against the city around these constitutional protections. One of these other ordinances is LAMC 8502, a municipal ordinance that prohibits vehicle dwelling, and it was renewed by City Council in a unanimous vote earlier this year. The prohibition of vehicle dwelling is such that vehicle dwelling is not allowed within 500 feet of parks, playgrounds, schools, places that have public restrooms, because God forbid that the unhoused should need to pee. But vehicle dwelling is also restricted in much of the city. So the city of Los Angeles, in its wisdom, has spent a lot of resources producing maps like this, because the unhoused really have nothing else to do than to look up the city website and find these maps, right? So supposedly vehicle dwelling is allowed in these green zones, but most of these green zones are tied up in parking restrictions. The ordinance is especially cruel since it comes at a time of rising houselessness and targets the one form of shelter over which the unhoused have a modicum of control, their car. Now I want to note that a few years ago, a court ruling struck down a similar ordinance, with the judge stating that this sort of ban criminalized innocent behavior. And that's what I want to focus on. Because what is being illegalized is innocent behavior. Why is it illegal to sleep in one's car? Why is it illegal to eat in one's car? The judge in that ruling noted that the ban was, I quote, incompatible with the concept of an even-handed administration of the law to the poor and to the rich that is fundamental to a democratic society. A whole set of other means of banishment are at work in Los Angeles. The research I've been currently doing with my graduate students under the tutelage of Shayla Myers, Pete White, Hamid Khan at Stop LAPD Spying has been around nuisance. And we are very interested in the ways in which nuisance law and nuisance lawsuits are being used by the city attorney's office to take control of entire neighborhoods. And much of these nuisance lawsuits, our preliminary findings indicate, are concentrated, not surprisingly, in South Central Los Angeles. And they target such things as residential hotels, which have been an important source of housing for those facing precarity. So I want to situate the question of nuisance and the criminalization of poverty in the broader context of carcerality in LA. My colleague at UCLA, Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who recently won what is called the Genius Award, the MacArthur Award, for her work on this project, $1 Million Hoods, has shown the ways in which LA is the carceral capital of the country. LA spends $1 billion a year criminalizing and incarcerating people. She also, as a historian, traces this back to a long history of incarceration and carcerality. But the $1 Million Hoods project highlights, and these are the areas in red, the various communities in which the LA Police Department and LA Sheriff's Department spend well over $1 million a year incarcerating people. These are also the very communities that have faced long histories of redlining, of racially restrictive covenants, of disinvestment. And this is just a zoom in on Lancaster, where you can see the millions of dollars that have been spent since 2010 on incarcerating Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies. But I also want to step back a bit, and as a scholar who does a lot of work in cities of the Global South, including India where I grew up, I want to share how the use of nuisance law is at work in many other parts of the world. And partly what we try to do in our housing justice network is to link struggles across these different global nodes. So I'm drawing here on two wonderful books on the capital city of India, Delhi, both of which highlight processes of spatial illegalization and show the ways in which propertied citizens repeatedly identify the housing of the urban poor, of the precariously housed as nuisance, and file public interest litigation to convince the courts to issue eviction orders. And the grounds of these evictions are often very dubious. Oh, that particular slum looks dirty. That particular slum seems to be polluting the river. And what has happened is it's not just communities, not just a particular kind of informal settlement like a slum that has been labeled a nuisance. What both Asher Gertner and Gautam Bhan show in these books is that entire categories of people have come to be designated as nuisance. That they themselves become a secondary category of citizens, not worthy of rights. This becomes a permanent state of rightlessness. So in fact, as Gautam Bhan shows, with the evolution of nuisance lawsuits in Delhi, the courts have shifted their language from talking about encroachment to talking about encroachers, talking about entire categories of the urban poor and the urban working classes as the encroacher, and the encroacher as the opposite of citizen, as someone unworthy of rights. The effects of this legal regime have been devastating in Delhi as they've been devastating in LA. So Gautam Bhan starts his book with the story of this settlement, Pushta, which is a community of about 150,000 people on the banks of the river Yamuna in Delhi. And what you're seeing is a satellite image of Pushta. Pushta before, Pushta after. Evicted in literally the blink of an eye as Delhi prepared for the Commonwealth Games that it hosted, right? But the key lawsuits that made possible a very violent eviction of 150,000 people was nuisance law, and the ways in which this entire slum was designated as nuisance. But I want to take this a step further. Spatial illegalization, these forms of criminalization, target those designated as racial others. It targets those designated as the poor. A lot of my work in India has been on how the illegalities and informalities of the wealthy are not recognized as illegalities. They are not criminalized. In fact, urban planning practices normalize and valorize and legalize the illegalities of the wealthy. So again, Gautam Bhan and Asher Gertner in their research on Delhi shows that a part of this eviction was driven by the fact that the slum was seen to be polluting the river Yamuna. They were on the riverbed of this major river. But also on the riverbed of the Yamuna are some of Delhi's iconic, quote-unquote, world-class developments, right? The Commonwealth Games Village, right? Many of these are projects of the state. The Delhi Metro Rail Depot, and this, the Akshardham Temple, which is the world's largest Hindu monument. No one's declared this to be illegal, when in fact, on the same grounds as the eviction of Pushta, this is totally illegal. So at the work we do at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, for which I have the great privilege of serving as founding director, we try to challenge and analyze these processes of spatial illegalization. And we do that by insisting that what we're seeing in cities like LA is not just market-driven displacement, but state-organized violence against targeted bodies and communities. And this is the beautiful artwork from Nico Avina based in Boyle Heights. I want to close, though, by talking about how also in Los Angeles there is a long history of extraordinary organizing around such forms of banishment. And that organizing and that activism has to be kept in mind. For example, we have seen most recently the emergence of vibrant tenant unions. The LA Tenant Union building on the long history of Unión de Vecinos, building in turn on the organizing by women in public housing projects such as Aliso Village. And in fact, as you will remember, Proposition 10 made it to the ballot. That was a victory, though it was defeated, and it was defeated because Blackstone spent $120 million defeating Prop 10. Recently, we've seen AB 1482, a somewhat limited bill pass that limits annual rent increases across the state to 5% plus inflation, and that creates some tenant protections. But today, houselessness and housing precarity remains an active terrain of struggle in LA, and I hope in the discussion we'll talk more about this. But I want to end with two thoughts. The first is at the Institute, as part of the Housing Justice and Unequal Cities Network, we've been trying to think about other parts of the world that might allow us to dream of some frameworks here in Los Angeles that seem out of reach, particularly in the context of a deeply settler colonial city. So I invite you all to keep an eye on Berlin, for example, a city where 85% of the population is made up of renters. There, earlier this year, thousands and thousands of residents took to the streets protesting high rents. My colleagues here from Germany can talk in greater detail to this issue, but we're keeping an eye on Berlin because there we have recently seen the passage of a 5-year rent freeze, but we are also seeing a referendum on the socialization of private rental housing. The referendum is that landlords who own more than 3,000 apartments in the city are facing expropriation and a socialization of this property that exceeds that ceiling. In the rest of the world, we've called this land reforms. And it might be time in the United States to think about some land reforms. And in particular, then, the question of land reforms brings me to where we started this evening. My colleagues in Melbourne, Australia, have just launched a very interesting housing collective. And one of the key mandates of that housing collective is that there can be no housing justice on stolen land. And if we in fact take seriously that there can be no housing justice on stolen land, we have to rethink the very concept of property and land itself, particularly in LA, where there are so many sedimented histories of banishment, from the elimination of Native people to the repatriation of Mexican citizens during the Great Depression, to Japanese internment, to urban renewal, on and on and on. Today's banishment uses legal tools such as gang injunctions and nuisance abatement to evict and push working-class communities of color to the far outskirts of our cities. But I also want to note that in LA in particular, banishment is a transnational geography of dispossession. In Los Angeles, urban policing is entangled with detention and deportation. So as Ilana Zilberg writes in her book on deportation, the Central American barrio in Los Angeles is haunted with voices from and banished to El Salvador. This is what Susan Kutin has called dismemberment, which is both injury to bodies, to migrant bodies, unhoused bodies, but also the continued attempt to erase memory, to erase communities altogether. So with that, I want to end with this particular acknowledgement, if you will. This is Belly, a Palestinian-Canadian rapper, responding to one of our country's loudest white supremacists, Tommy Lahren, who at the height of the Muslim ban and Trump's declarations of the militarization of the border, stated that we owe illegal immigrants nothing. We can replace the word immigrants with the unhoused. And Belly reminding us all that no one is illegal on stolen land. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I want to introduce Barbara Schönig, who can tell us a bit more about the Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen movement that's happening in Berlin right now. Barbara studied urban planning, German literature, and history of arts in Berlin and Columbus. In her PhD, she focused on metropolitan planning and civil society in the United States. Before becoming a professor for urban planning at Bauhaus University Weimar in 2012, she taught at Technical University Berlin and Technical University Darmstadt. She is director of the Institute for European Studies and the vice dean of the Department for Architecture and Urbanism at Bauhaus University Weimar. Her research focuses on critical studies of planning and its role within processes and practices of space production. Fields of research include interdisciplinary housing research, social housing, and participation in urban development, as well as processes of spatial restructuring of urban, suburban, and rural areas.
Well, thank you very much. Is that okay? I'm very happy to be able to speak to you tonight and to be invited to this great event. Thank you very much for having me here. Can you hear me in the back? No? Okay, so. Okay, is that better, right? No? Yes? Better? Closer, but then it's echoing so awfully. It's okay? Okay. Well, thank you already for linking the first talk to the second one, because indeed, I will be talking a little bit, focusing a little bit differently on this issue, as I will be talking about housing in Germany and the housing crisis that we're facing in Germany, and especially how it came so far and what could be done to face and challenge it, to change things the way they are. And you'll see that also the other thing that Ananya Roy mentioned, the financialization issue, will play a big role, a large role, an important role in that part of the history, but not only that, also urban development and the way urban policies and financial policies actually are intermingling and creating the situation we have and what we could be doing about it. So, of course, we heard already people all over the globe experience homelessness. And to address this issue, of course, we need to ensure that there are housing options for everybody. And obviously the question how this could be done also is pressing over the world, so I'm glad that this is a very international panel here. Housing for all is, as has been stated before, the key to create just cities. And this is of course true because housing is a basic need. But being an urban planner, I would like to claim something more. Housing is even more than that. First, housing constitutes the major part of our cities. Its quality, design, and location to a large extent determines the social structure of our cities. It can foster segregation or urban integration, for example. Secondly, we also should notice that the availability of housing for all parts of the population and workforce is also a precondition for the urban economies to function. And third, we shouldn't forget that housing imprints also our ecological footprint. Be it in terms of land, commuting necessities, or building material, the way housing is provided and built influences our consumption of ecological resources. And for all these reasons, the question how, at what price, and for whose profit housing is being provided, the housing question in a very comprehensive manner, is critical to our cities, societies, and our planet. And to address the housing question appears to be a necessity to secure the right to housing the right to the city, and maybe also the right to a planet still livable. However, wherever we look on this planet, we must face that organizing and providing housing hardly seems to follow this line. Instead, we see housing and urban inequality increasing, and I claim that this will not change unless we stop understanding housing alongside the general logics of capitalism, as long as housing is being treated as a commodity to be provided by the market. And in fact, in Germany, there is rising awareness for this, as housing has become an issue of severe political discourse and social conflict during the last years. Well, this might feel wrong, and listening about the situation in LA, it indeed sounds hardly to be as drastic as the things that you experience here, but nevertheless, it might feel wrong at the first glance to talk about housing crisis in Germany. Actually, international comparative studies until the late 90s had praised Germany for its integrated housing market and its socially integrated cities, for providing quality housing for the large majority of people at moderate prices. And still today, people in Germany don't face a housing trouble when compared to the majority of people living on this globe. They enjoy housing conditions others could dream of. Just to illustrate, 2 examples to illustrate this. As you can see on the left side, less than 8% of the population experience overcrowding in their housing. And as indicated on the graph on the right, also housing costs still are comparatively low in our cities if you compare it to large cities elsewhere. So the current housing conflict isn't rooted in a general lack of housing and housing quality. Instead, it is caused by an increasing lack of housing affordability. In Germany, 16% of the population face housing cost overburden. Compared to other European states, this is very high, and that's why you see Germany in the red color. And in fact, during the last decades, rents have steadily increased. This has affected, especially but not exclusively, the major cities and their surrounding areas. To pinpoint at Berlin, as an example, rents for apartments offered on the market doubled within only 10 years, from 5.5 euros per square meter to 11 euros. This trend indeed is alarming, and as I said before, it has brought the housing question back into the political discourse. And this is worth to note. Actually, for almost 30 years, the provision of housing hardly was discussed at all in Germany. So what has happened? In fact, radical transformations took place during these years. Those altogether added up to the housing crisis we experience today. The transformation of housing policy, of the housing market, and of urban politics in general. Let me first briefly have a look at housing policy. As in many other Western welfare states, housing policy has been dismantled during the last decades. But also, from its early beginnings after 1945, German housing policy was grounded on the idea that state intervention into a housing market should absolutely be restricted to cases of market failure. Of course, I'm talking about the West Germany and not about the GDR at that point. Because, well, basically, on the GDR territory, the West German housing policy was implemented after 1990. Of course, this idea of restricting housing policy to cases of market failure was the case immediately after World War II. Due to war destruction and the influx of refugees, roughly 6 million apartments were missing in 1945. Therefore, for the time being, social housing for all parts of or almost all parts of the society, subsidized by the state, became the major instrument of housing policy in West Germany. But as soon as the post-war housing crisis seemed to be mitigated, more market-oriented instruments were implemented, such as individual housing subsidies and home ownership. So by the mid-1980s, the conservative liberal government proclaimed the post-war housing crisis to be solved finally. This legitimated a retrenchment from direct state intervention in the housing market. Social housing subsidies were successively reduced, as you can see here. See here, so this is 1980s, the end of the social housing. And then we saw the influx of refugees, of people coming from Eastern Europe and the GDR. And then for a temporary housing crisis, actually subsidies were going up again for a short time and then reduced and ended up finally being not existent in 2013, 14, until today. Well, it changed a little. But there was more to be that was done. By 2001, social housing was legally redefined to serve only people in housing emergency. And in 2006, the national state officially handed responsibility for social housing to the states without giving money, actually, for that. And at the same time, occupancy rights for existing social housing units were phasing out. That's what you see here. In consequence, social housing basically diminished from the German housing market. Out of 2.8 million units of social housing in 1990, only 1.2 million units were left in 2016. This transformation of housing policy went along with profound changes on the housing market. Already, by 1990, the large non-profit sector, the non-profit housing sector in Germany was taken off its tax privileges and legally abolished. In consequence, non-profit housing companies all over the country sold their units or transformed them into market rate housing. Beginning in the 1990s, profit-oriented investors and later on financialized companies bought large housing stocks. Only in the short time between 1990 and 2010, German cities sold almost 2 million municipal housing units to those kind of investors. This especially affected, of course, the formerly affordable segments, most of them in the cities, where very high profits could be expected. Additionally, individuals increasingly bought apartments. For a long time, Germany's urban areas had been known as cities of renters. However, as welfare policies were dismantled, also pensions were privatized. And so residential property for many people became an important asset for their private retirement plan. Again, this affected especially cities. In Berlin, for example, that Ananya just pointed out, there you still see a very high amount of renters, but the rate of home ownership increased by 25% from 9% in 2000 to 18% in 2018. These individual investments in home ownership put, of course, additional pressure on the rental market. Unfortunately, in the beginning, all this was hardly confronted with public discontent. Social housing and the non-profit housing sector had few supporters anyway. Social conflicts and mismanagement in social housing neighborhoods had considerably damaged their image. Additionally, German politics from 1990 on was very much focusing on other things, such as, for example, the impact of reunification or the European integration. And also, at the local level, means and interests to block the loss of affordable housing were low. Urban politics in many cities had turned to entrepreneurial strategies. Many cities faced local fiscal deficits and a loss of industry, so attracting jobs and educated urban classes for many was the primary goal. Therefore, they focused on inner-city upgrading and upscale housing. Social housing was commissioned only in marginal numbers. Also, selling municipal housing seemed an easy way to clear public debts. In these ways, urban policies added substantially to the lack of affordable housing and the loss of existing affordable housing. During these years, spatial segregation within major cities increased. Inner cities were gentrified, and affordable housing was left only in a few neighborhoods, oftentimes in the city's edges. As described, national housing policy and municipal housing strategies faded away, with hardly anybody noticing. What we face today is the result of all of this, of the dismantling of housing policy and the increasing capitalization of urban development and housing. And in reaction to that, to the effects of this, the housing question entered the political discourse in Germany again. So, however, it isn't easy to explain the housing question as such in Germany. Housing problems in Germany are polarized. This is true in spatial terms. As I said, economically flourishing cities and urban regions experience increasing housing crises. Those areas appear in dark red at the map, and you can easily identify Munich, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Munich. That's very easy. But what about the rest of the country? People in rural and economically weak areas, however, are confronted with different housing problems, high vacancy rates, and an increasing lack of housing and living quality. Structures like renovations, schools, doctors, shops disappear, and public transportation is not available. These are also housing questions, though different ones than in the cities, of course. But the housing question also is socially polarized. Low-income households have seen the highest increase in housing cost. Those living in poverty spend much more than the rest of the population in housing, almost 40% of their net income. At the same time, space per person grew in general, but while low-income households gained only 1 square meter per person, higher income households gained 10 square meters per person and currently live on average on 90 square meters per person. So there's a large difference between different households and their incomes. So housing inequality in terms of space and cost seems to grow. And as I said before, middle and low income households are confronted with an ongoing increase in prices for real estate and rents. In reaction to the shortage of affordable housing, national government stepped back into housing policy. At least temporarily, subsidies for social housing were increased. However, general corrections of market-oriented housing policy remain out of sight. To do so, it would be necessary to rethink the fundamental questions of housing provision in general. So housing is a human right. In capitalist societies, it is fundamentally structured by its contradictory nature of being a basic need and a market good at once. Within modern societies, extent of regulation and provision of housing, therefore, has always been subject to general negotiations within society. Those result in compromise on the housing question, nationally specific housing regimes. These housing regimes were framed by the specific national welfare regimes they were embedded in. And globalized, flexible capitalism has permeated and radically changed our societies and personal life. It also has challenged the national housing regimes and increased the dynamics of housing markets. And in reaction to the devastating effects of this on housing provision, social movements now question the dominating perspective on market-oriented housing provision in Germany and urban development. All over the country, be it in Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, or also smaller towns such as Weimar or Jena. They request the housing question to be negotiated anew in Germany. A very remarkable example of this has been mentioned already. It is the petition for the so-called expropriation of large housing companies in Berlin. Deutsche Wohnen enteignen, translated expropriate Deutsche Wohnen. The title is misleading in fact. The initiative doesn't object at expropriation. Instead, it refers to Article 15 in our constitution, that is not a constitution, but called Grundgesetz, the German basic law. That's what they are referring to. This article has never been applied so far in the history of Germany. Article 15 explicitly allows the socialization of land, natural resources, and means of production against compensation. But the objective of this socialization must be that the title to be socialized is to be used for the purpose of public ownership and the common economy. The petition asks the Senate of Berlin to carry out a referendum. It suggests municipalizing all housing and land in Berlin possessed by private for-profit companies that own more than 3,000 housing units in Berlin. The housing company Deutsche Wohnen itself holds roughly 115,000 units in the metropolitan area of Berlin, approximately 5% of all the housing in the area. And it owns even more units all over Germany. As the initiative claims, companies such as Deutsche Wohnen possess major and illegitimate market power at the housing market. Also, they focus on profit instead of providing people with a basic good in adequate quality. They in general show little interest in maintaining houses and neighborhoods, as their first interest is to satisfy their owners' or shareholders' interests. The petition, for these reasons, suggests the units to be socialized to be administered by a new municipal housing corporation. This corporation is to be controlled by the public and its renters. Deutsche Wohnen enteignen, at first hand, but not exclusively, aims at rebuying the housing stock that used to be owned by municipal housing companies before These were sold to large companies such as Deutsche Wohnen in the 1990s and early 2000s. For that reason, one of their slogans is, "We just want back our houses." Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen might sound like a radical left-wing position, but the claim gained support from a large part of the population in Berlin. Within only 3 months, 77,000 people signed the petition. The initiative collected 3 times the amount of signatures necessary to force the Berlin government to organize the referendum in only half the time allowed. Currently now, it is being discussed whether the referendum complies with constitutional law of Berlin state and can be carried out at all. But one thing is certain by now already. The public pressure caused by its own politics and the real estate lobby is enormous. Obviously, as you can see, resistance against the ever-increasing dynamic market-oriented housing and urban policy is growing. Also, awareness is increasing that the capitalization of housing and urban policy is growing. It's not only an issue in terms of shelter, but that it also threatens the social integration of our cities. This is true all the more as the number of households living in poverty and need of housing continues to grow also in Germany. Taking this into account and seeking for arguments in favor of the socialization of housing, it might be helpful to rethink our understanding of housing. The development in Germany shows the need to regain control over distribution and prices of land and housing. To get there, I suggest a new conceptual understanding of housing. Housing indeed is a basic need, but even more, it also is a critical infrastructure that structures our lives, cities, and our society. And just as water, energy, and streets, the least of us have the means and knowledge to provide for it on our own. Once built, it will be there to structure our lives for quite some time. It gives shelter, it provides for social life, and our well-being. And without adequate and quality provision that everybody can afford, societies and the cities will fall apart. If that is true, however, we can hardly allow land to be developed only for the profit of its owner. We can hardly be content with reducing state intervention only to cases of individual housing emergency. There are many instruments that could be used, many of those already in the law books in Germany. We could, for example, establish a strong non-profit housing sector again. We could communalize housing. We could control rents, and we do that already in Berlin, as Ananya just has stated. We could give developing rights to socially integrated projects instead of the maximizing profit investor. We just need to use these tools. Through the current crisis and the social movements today, we have the chance to renegotiate our understanding of housing. To ensure adequate and affordable housing provision for all, we must acknowledge that housing is a basic infrastructure of society, and that market logic so far have never been apt to solve the housing question and its many related issues. And we must doubt they ever will. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I want to introduce Crushow Herring, who also goes by Showzart when he is making his art. He is a virtuoso artist born in Kansas City, Missouri, where he first attributes his passion for community and making a difference to his mother, Sharita J. Herring of the Creative Images Foundation. She instilled early in his life that it's important to inspire and support others. Secondly, he credits his father, Jerry E. Herring, who's also an artist, with his illustrative abilities. As early as he can remember, Crushow sat next to his father, absorbing everything he could from his unique artistic talents. Actively working from the streets of Skid Row in downtown LA to sitting in the boardrooms of City Hall, Crushow has consistently been instrumental in fighting for equal rights for everyone and creating programs and services that aid not only the disenfranchised, but create opportunities for all races, religions, and nationalities. As he continuously forms collaborations with fellow artists to make a difference and constantly seeks the objective of community empowerment, his objective is not to focus on the negative, but through provocative art to fixate on bringing awareness and celebrating insurmountable accomplishments while proactively conveying consciousness to stimulate positive action for collaborative change. He's also the COO and founder of the social enterprise Without Shelter, who's here tonight.
How's everybody doing? How's everybody doing? Okay, I'm just making sure we're all present. You know, I appreciate everybody being here. Let's make sure we're present today. This is something that's actually vital. Me personally, at the moment, and until things seem to change, I currently am unsheltered. I do my business, I do my art, all off of making sure that my everyday is purpose. It's not to figure out what box I'm going to be in today. It's about what I'm going to be accomplishing to make sure that you guys and those outside of here understand that we all have a purpose. And I feel my purpose is to do more here than to worry about what box I live in, because my box will probably be taller than most of you guys and bigger when we leave. So I'm gonna worry about what I'm doing now to make sure things get greater. I can't worry about how to get better for myself without trying to make the world greater. So I'm gonna explain, a little bit of my journey and what I'm involved in to pull a solution to the issue that has been designed to be in place. And they've done a great job about designing it. And I don't feel it's going to end anytime soon, because I can't see how the billions of dollars that they have allocated, they're not going to use. So I can't see it ending anytime soon. So as was stated, my name is Crushow Herring. Now, this is my first time I'm going to see this slide, so we'll speak about it as they come forward. One thing that I've noticed within my organizing here in South LA and Skid Row is opportunity, is lack of. I became a member of Skid Row 20 years ago from not tragic incidents. Being an actual artist and professional athlete, once I came back from overseas and came back to America, I was a nigga again. I was no longer a human being. I was no longer considered with the upper echelon, because I was now thrown back into a barrel full of what categories and statistics are. And for me personally, it was a mental shock. I had always been considered a top 5-year-old, a top 13-year-old, pretty high scholar to be amongst others, and to finally get to a certain, ceiling to where you're smacked in the face to understand everything that you've done besides even with your college education or how far you've been across the water, that you're still considered labels, black, less of, property. And it was a shock for me to where it caused me to become in Skid Row, because I was tired of competing in a race that does not exist with me anymore. At the time, I didn't realize that we all don't start with the same tools, because, we're given a dream that we all have the same, goals. And as long as you push forward, everything is going to happen for you until you really see reality that it's not designed that way. This monopoly board is designed in a real critical way to keep its foot on certain culture's neck. From coming back into Los Angeles after me being overseas playing basketball and trying to pursue my professional career, it drove me to try, once I came back, I wanted to see if I would be able to still pursue it. So I started working at the local YMCA just to get community in, so I could still have community. And at this time, I didn't notice that this was my goal and this was my purpose, which is actually being community. Using the YMCA to actually helped me get back in shape and to have free access to use the facility to hopefully get my opportunity to play professional basketball again, I ended up finding a struggle that I didn't realize that I was in from the time I was at youth. By raise of hands, how many of you have ever had to sleep at your your auntie's house or your grandmother's house because of financial burden within your family? Have any of you ever, at one point, had to relocate to a family member's home to live until something else came abrupt? And for me, it had happened more than usual. But within myself, as you'll notice on the shirts of my partners, I was still whole. And it didn't dawn on me that at that time I was also unsheltered. I still moved the way I needed to move at school. I still had the same joyful smile that I had, regardless that I wasn't going to the same place once I left my original boundaries. And one thing I started to notice was I needed to be like the tree. And one thing that I've seen in California is really important. You can see it real well. These trees aren't domestic. They aren't from here. Most trees here, they come from somewhere else, right? They're grown here, but they still operate in the same form and fashion from where they're cultivated. If it's a tree from the Midwest, we don't even have seasons here, but the tree still, the leaves still turn its colors, leaves still fall. So trees seem to know purpose. Most things still have to know purpose. So once I found purpose and I realized that I had inner self, regardless of where I was at, I had inner peace. That's what allowed me to move throughout the world until I came back to California and realized that they wanted my inner peace. They wanted to make sure that I could not have inner peace. Once I started community organizing in South LA, in Skid Row, I ran into what my partner is speaking on: racial profiling and incrimination, false incriminalization. I had Los Angeles Central Division telling me that they did not want me working in the community, doing the work that I was doing with my associates in the community that is in Skid Row, or I would soon face a drug charge, which sooner or later did happen. From the drug charge, it ended up driving me back into the streets, being unsheltered. This was 4 years ago. I have not pursued to actually fix that situation because I don't feel that I'm broken. I haven't stopped doing the things that I was doing before they incarcerated me or tried to incarcerate me. So I haven't stopped any of my movement, and I don't feel that I am unsheltered. I feel like I am home. I have inner peace. Even though I came out of a tent today. I look okay, This is fresh out of a tent, But my thing is, when I came to Skid Row as a drug dealer. And I was so enthused and I was so encouraged to claim the area by the way I was receiving the love from her. Because all she's ever done for me is love me. She's never been a burden to me at all. She's only uplifted me. She's only given me everything I've needed, regardless if most think it's bad or if most think it's good. Skid Row's a mother. She's a female. She gives you everything you need. Now you can treat her how you wish. You have to deal with your father when it's all over. So it matters how you treat her when you're here, and she'll give you everything you need. That's why we have so many community members, because she'll provide for you as long as you tell her what you need. For most, it might be negative, but it's what they're needing at the moment to understand that we have a lot of pressure on us that has been established and seems to be here to stay. One thing that I've noticed is we're trying to fix this problem from the top when it starts here at the bottom, and it has to be fixed from the bottom. I've been blessed enough to see how the change has came in Skid Row from bringing art with LA Poverty Department, working with people concerned on working on housing programs to help bring subsidized permanent housing into the communities. This was a mural that I did with 72 and Sunny, 72 and You, and the mayor's office to actually bring an actual announcement to the neighbors, or some call NIMBYs, that it's going to happen, that we are coming in your backyards. It's happening. There's 72,800 some odd people that are on the verge of actually being unsheltered. One check away from being unsheltered. That means if your car breaks down and you need that to get to work, you happen to want to pay your car bill to get your car fixed, you're late on your rent. And how do you catch up from that if you don't have another income to fill in from there? So that means you're behind month after month after month. So pretty soon, they'll be asking you to move out. Bless you. So with me being in Skid Row for the years that I've been, I ended up finding out after I ran into the one case with LAPD that my main focus needed to be on my purpose and not actually trying to be so forceful with my organizing. And the best way that I could put that was for me to let go and actually do the things that I've always done when I consider myself one of the top, 13-year-olds or individuals in a room as of right now. We're all doing well, but I feel I'm just as well and just as blessed as everyone in these seats, regardless of my position. And for me to feel that, I had to think back for when I came to any new location, what was the main thing that I always did? And the main thing that I always did wherever I went was to make sure I produced my art. I call myself an art Jedi, or virtuoso artist, meaning I have many talents when it comes to doing art, as far as expressing myself, to use it as therapy. And I wanted to know if anyone else in my community used art for therapy. And I discovered that we had LA Poverty Department, and we had a bunch of jewels and diamonds in the rough here in Skid Row that actually produced art and loved to do art. With that being said, I locked into myself and figured the best thing for me to do was just to produce art, stay within myself, and run in my own path. When I went to school, the only thing I could remember is, with all new associates, I never tried to go fit in, or I never tried to see how I could associate. I would just sit and draw, and whoever was interested in me would come over to see what I was doing. And from that point, we established a relationship. So being in Skid Row, I noticed that that's how I would gather my relationship with the community. I would draw, and I would see who would want to connect with me besides being the guy that's coming saying, hey, I know how to help you. Hey, I'm better than you. I know how to help you. Hey, can I pray for you? Can I pray for you? Not can we pray together, but can I pray for you? Because I have the answers. Can I help you? Because I know. Instead of me pointing at someone, I stayed trying to figure my own path out. Because as long as I stayed focusing on how well I could compete in this race, I was forgetting about my purpose, and I was also forgetting about someone else's being left behind. So I couldn't focus on that, oh man, I need to get into a house, because I was going to still find my problem that I was going to run into, that I wasn't accepted, because I was in the wrong race. That's not my race. Like I said, how can I be looking for any type of credibility in this land that's stolen? I'm not looking for any credibility from this land. I'm not looking for any credibility from any of you. I'm in my human experience, making sure that I can love you the best way I can and be my best light to make sure that you know your next step does not come without you worrying about someone else having their next step. And through my process, I have went to many meetings, as I say, to where I'm running into those that are trying to do it from the top when it needs to happen from the bottom. And when people are coming to the bottom, no one's listening. No one's listening. Everyone's telling how they have a way to get this fixed. Everyone's telling that they know what's going on, but no one's actually sitting and listening. That man that's yelling on the corner, he's actually saying something. If you just would listen. So I learned to listen while I was drawing. And through me listening while I learned to draw, I end up grabbing a connection to where they'll tell me how I can tend to help each individual that I run into. And that's key, because every individual is different. And we keep setting up certain shells and certain, skeletons that aren't working and aren't fitting for each individual. And there's a lot of individuals, but I mean, there's a lot of us also that if we would just take the time to see how we can help the next individual. So through the process of me doing my artwork and having these meetings, I said, how can I be more of a force instead of just always talking or just speaking about it or saying, hey, we need to get this done? What can be my actual end game? How can I actually make something work to where they're going to see that I'm just not talking? Yeah, they see me get out of my tent, they see me get dressed, they see me bring my kids there, they see me on TV, but how can I give her back what she gave me for 20 years? Because I'm here after 20, and I'm standing here, and I'm speaking to you guys. So how can I give her back 20? And I figured that I would do it through my art. And through my art, I would make sure that I produce something that could get people an opportunity to actually bring them closer to the starting point. Because who knows how anyone wants to finish. But if I could just bring people to the starting point, at least I'm doing my job and my duty within my art to have purpose. So through this, as I create Without Shelter, we've created the street cleaning service. We've created in Skid Row History Museum. We've created Skid Row Brigade. We have the refresh spot. And these are things that we are coming up with in the whole. So through that, I saw that community can actually make something build. So I sat and I put my mind to it. I had a meeting with a friend of mine who's now my business partner, Orion Brutico. At the time, I met this young man going to meetings for economical infrastructure in Skid Row. And that was big for me to say, okay, they're thinking about how they can actually bring jobs into Skid Row. A lot of people are always bringing what they can. I mean, I remember at one point I was bringing cocaine, So everybody has their curve. And I'm happy to now bring something totally different to a community that actually needs something, But most of us are saying, hey, he just handed out a sandwich and said, Jesus loves you. But, hey, he handed a sandwich. He wasn't trying to pollute, I was doing something totally different. So I've always learned to not judge how people come, because you're doing a whole lot better than when I first came. And so I appreciate you coming in this fashion. So when I meet Orion Brutico, he's actually going to USC for his graduates. He's at graduate school for his master's in social work. And we meet at an office that's called Skid Row Enterprise. And at this meeting, we're trying to figure how can we actually make a big difference in Skid Row to where people in the streets feel that they're cared about and know that we're actually trying to make a difference. So within that, we have many meetings in this fashion, and we're trying to put our minds together to figure out we're trying to put our minds together to figure out what would actually work to where people can see an instant impact. Know it's going to work for them. And one day Orion he's rushing. I can't remember what we're meeting about, and he makes the statement. He says, hey, Crushow, I have to go because I have a real big investor that's looking to put some big money towards a donation towards me. $10,000 to $15,000. What would you do with that? And I gave him the idea of employing the unsheltered, creating a product to where most people that I've noticed in Skid Row and other places that we were seeing in the red areas that are actually predominantly black and brown and deprived areas, they have a hustle to where they'll sell any product that they can because they actually have the salesmanship to sell things. But most of the time they don't have the license to make the sale or the actual contract to sell that product. So my whole thing was, okay, I can create a product that I will give them the opportunity and they will have the license to actually sell my product that I will come up with. And every product that sells can actually employ someone else. And as long as it keeps working from that, it can actually house. So Orion, I guess he liked the idea, so 2 days later, he came back to me and asked, are you ready to start that business? And for me, I'm saying yes. So we come up with a solution, and it's called Without Shelter. And that's where my focus is now within my organizing, to turn my art into help housing people. When you work with Without Shelter, once you work with us after 90 days, we have landlords that are willing to work with our social enterprise that have lowered their rent rates to make sure we can house. And we're paying their first month's rent, and then from that moment, as they're still working with us, we take a deductible away from each one of their sales and we put it up to where, regardless of what they're doing, we'll still make sure that we can help cover their rent for them to be able to keep the establishment until they choose something else. But the main thing is just giving them the kickstart to get to the starting point. Every watch, so we designed a watch to where it's made of bamboo. All right, it's environmentally sourced, so it's safe for the environment. It's very light, and we price it at a certain price to make sure that we can actually keep the promise that we're actually setting out to our contractors. We're telling you in 90 days we're going to house you, and we're starting it from we don't have a fund put up to make sure that we can house. We have to make sure we get out the same way every day when we woke up to get a hustle on. We have to get out, we have to make the money. So you have to believe, and you have to make sure you get the connection to make that happen. But bigger than that, it has to be about the purpose. And the purpose is to help 2 other people. So it's not about the watch, because you can go get a watch from anywhere. It's about the purpose of why you're pushing to sell the watch, to get the message out so it's a vibration. Because I feel everything is like spider webs. Whatever hits here, it vibrates in one direction and it goes around. So where we can put a vibration out with these watches, because it's time for everybody to jump on board and realize that we can make a change if we come together. You know, so in your pamphlets, I set a count me in sheet inside that says count me in. If you don't have a count me in sheet, can you please raise your hand so I can get you one? If possible, I'd like for you, Charles, can you get this young lady a count me in sheet? If possible, if you could fill that out so I could put you on an email list so I can make contacts to make sure I can keep you informed on how well we're doing, how many we're housing. I'm making sure that we keep the update on to know how many people that we're having housed, how many people we're having employed, because we really see this going and stretching out across the nation. We're getting calls elsewhere, but the main thing is to make sure we have this core going real well here, because this is it's a baby at the moment. We're starting it with $10,000. Everything's put into the product, so there's no seed money put up to make sure we can house. So everything is just all making sure it's the effort to make sure you can lift someone else up that you've been next to. And it's been working well. We have 7 partners, and we all realize that we can't make this happen without each other. And that's the one thing that happens. It's like this room, it's a community. And as long as we come together as a community, we can make change. This is the only place in Los Angeles or in the States that I know that we're able to have tents set up. And as what was said earlier, it's because we stand strong as a community to make sure that we know that we have each other's back. So through this whole conference this week and throughout your life, if possible, can you just keep your head up to understand that you can't do anything, first off, without the energy of positivity. And second, without the person next to you, regardless if you know them or not. And I appreciate having the time to let you guys just hear who I am and give it a shot. If you can, please fill out the count me in sheet. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you guys at the table, because this is the type of audience that I've created this brand for. Those that wish to show that you're on the team. You know what I mean? You're walking around, you're here. And you're here to show that you're just not here for yourself. And pretty soon, when it's real popular, everybody's just want to, like the Tom shoes, you know? Everybody's want to show that they had it on, but the main thing is realizing to put the brand out because of the purpose. It's not even about what we're producing. And as a social enterprise, we're here to take comments from anyone of what should be put out. Even things that are even more useful than watches. My whole thing is the watch will start to bring my people and my community back into time. Because right now, we don't care about time. Time is no concern to us. So if I can get them back on the note of thinking of time and giving them more set blocks of having responsibility and accountability being accountable for certain things, and people are being accountable and looking for them to be accountable, then I feel we can make a big dent in what we're doing. So, thank you.
Thank you. So our last speaker, before we break into a panel and a group discussion, is Michele Lancione. He's an urban ethnographer and activist interested in issues of marginality and diversity, homelessness, and radical politics. His works have been published in top international journals in the field of urban geography, housing studies, and anthropology. His first edited volume is entitled Rethinking Life at the Margins, while his non-academic work include a collaborative documentary around forced evictions in Bucharest, Romania. Michele is also one of the founders and editors of the open-source Radical Housing Journal, an editor of City and corresponding editor for Europe at IJURR. He is based at the Urban Institute and the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Sheffield in the UK.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's great for me to be here, and I would like to thank you for being here as well, and for listening to me for the next 20 minutes. I would like to talk about home, and I think actually that my talk, what I'm going to say about home, fits very well with what we just heard, with the last presentation that we just heard. And I want to start by saying that this particular talk emerges at one particular intersection. And this intersection is exactly the intersection of home. And this is an intersection that to some extent excites me and drives me, but at the same time frustrates me profoundly. So I'm actually quite stressed about this. And I would like to bring you into this kind of frustration for the next 20 minutes, okay? And in that kind of frustration, I would like you to meet some people, the people that I met in my work in Southern and Eastern Europe in the past 10 years. And so to start with, I would like to introduce you to Paolo. So I met Paolo in 2009 while I was doing fieldwork in Turin. Turin is a city in the north of Italy, about 1 million inhabitants, not far from Milan. So we were sitting on this bench, and on this bench we were talking, chatting, smoking, eating pizza, because this is what you do in Italy, okay? And Paolo was telling me about this therapeutic community for drug users located in Tuscany, okay? He spent some time in this particular community in the early 2000s. And part of the story was about how he got hooked to heroin when the stuff was almost freely available on the road of Turin in the early 80s. And part of the story was also about him smuggling cocaine for tourists on expensive holidays in Kenya. But this was not the whole thing. He was excited, Paolo, about a new relationship with the lady he was in love with. He was worried whether his mother would forgive him. He loved to make collages. His life flickered between more or less stable times. He had periods on the street and also periods in which he was housed. Okay? He was a homeless drug user, but also a peer educator. He was a giver as well as a taker, a friend as well as an informer, a hustler, and just another body, if you want, sliced by the hot Italian sun. Although also here in LA, you do quite well in terms of sun. So he was, in a sense, a very plural and complex individual, Paolo. Okay? And what Paolo showed me is the poverty of social science and policy when it comes to capturing this kind of multiplicity, okay? This energetic complexity of life. So our discourses about homelessness often silence and contain. They are there to measure and control. They try to fit Paolo into the definition of the homeless, which can then be translated into a set of policies for a service user. They contrast Paolo with a normal subject, and that subject is a subject at home, okay? So the question I like to ask to all of you here is, how can we do more? I'm not simply saying, how can we do more to respect Paolo complexity, but more to demolish the silencing operating by normative discourse and see once and for all the light that comes through, okay, and from life of the margins and the life of Paolo. How do we avoid reducing a life to one single dimension? How do we avoid to reduce a life to Paolo the homeless, Paolo the drug users, Paolo the dealer, to start instead to conceive life in its multiplicity and its radical politics? So my argument in the next 20 minutes is that we should do essentially three things, okay? The first one is that we must attack what I call the knowledge economy of homelessness, and I am part of that economy, okay? So you need to attack me, essentially. The second is that we need to rethink the ways we talk about home, to stop seeing home as the opposite of homelessness, okay? And this is a tricky point, but it's an important one. And thirdly, when it comes to resistance, we must look to life at the margins for inspiration. I mean, we just heard it from Crushow. We need to start from below, okay? And we need to be attentive to that life in its own terms. So I will just start with this idea of the knowledge economy of homelessness, okay? So, to understand why homelessness is such an established feature of our urban landscape, of our cities, we must move beyond the idea that it reflects an objective social phenomenon that is happening out there. Instead, we need to look at how homelessness is made, how homelessness is constructed by our capitalistic society, not only in monetary terms, as we heard already, but also by scientific discourses, policy, and practices that constitute this particular kind of knowledge economy. The effects of this economy are in front of us all the time. In fact, if you think about it, nowadays, you don't need to encounter a homeless person to know about homelessness. You always know about it in advance because you have seen it on the social media, because you have read something about it, so you always know about it. And this particular fact that you know about it derives from the production of knowledge around homelessness. And that particular production of knowledge actually silences the subject of homelessness and replaces that particular subject with a normal idea, a stereotype. And this is important because then this is reproduced at the level of policy and intervention as well. So the individual experience, in a sense, completely vanishes and it's replaced by patronizing knowledge and patronizing ideas. So I want to show you why this is important, and here is another story, okay? And this story takes place in your beautiful country. So, on a November night in 2012, police officer Larry De Primo was patrolling Times Square in Manhattan. He saw a homeless person sitting barefoot and he was deeply moved, okay? So De Primo decided to buy the man a pair of shoes and socks. And then you have another character, Jennifer Foster, a tourist from Arizona, who saw this act of charity and took a photo with her mobile phone. And this is the picture. Her picture was then published by the New York Police Department on their Facebook page, and from there it went viral. Indeed, I heard this story while I was living in Sydney, in Australia. So within a few hours, this particular image was viewed by 1.6 million people, and it got hundreds of thousands of likes. And in fact, as you can see, also our friends Donald tweeted about it. So I was intrigued by this response, okay? And I analyzed 48,000 comments. I have nothing better to do, as you can see. I analyzed 48,000 comments under the original Facebook post. I wanted to understand how people were talking about this case. And many of the comments praised the virtuous act of Larry the Primo. Larry the Primo is the policeman, okay? And compared this act to what the Good Samaritan does in the Bible, okay? As you know, if you don't know, I'm telling you now, the Samaritan in the original story is the unknown quantity, okay? He is the foreigner, the potential enemy, okay? But he nonetheless helps a man who has been robbed and beaten in the street in an act of neighborly love that transcends barriers and asks for nothing in return. The implication of this particular gospel is that we owe each other a concrete form of practical care, even if we are strangers. But this framing denies the robbed man a voice, okay? In the parable, the relation between the Samaritan and the robbed man follows a one-way route. It is the Samaritan who loves the robbed man. It is him, the Samaritan, who cares. And it is the Samaritan who defines the tempo of the encounter. Okay? And no point in the gospel is the robbed man given a voice. Jesus doesn't tell us anything about the robbed man. Okay? We don't know if he has appreciated what the Samaritan did, what he thinks about the whole affair. And we can only assume his emotional response. And similarly, in this case, in the modern case, in the case of the Primo, we hear only the voice of the Primo. We hear only the voice of the Samaritan, only the voice of the police officer. The homeless person is a blank recipient. The homeless person is uncharacterized, okay? But in our story, something else happened. Because at some point, the poor speaks. His name is Jeffrey Hillman, a 54 years old army veteran. And we need to listen to Jeffrey, okay, to Jeffrey Hillman. We need to listen to him because once you hear his voice, the whole relationship of care, the whole beauty of love and charity crumbles. On the 2nd of December, the New York Times published an article titled, "Homeless Man is grateful for officer gifts of goods, but he again is barefoot." A journalist following up the story had gone back to Times Square and found that Mr. Jeffrey Hillman wasn't wearing the shoes he had been given. When asked why, this is important, when asked why, Mr. Hillman replied, "Those shoes," this is interesting the way you just reacted. He sold them. Listen what he said. He said, Mr. Hillman replied, "Those shoes are hidden. They are worth a lot of money. I could lose my life." While he was grateful for the gift, Hillman was deeply uncomfortable about his story being so well known. Everybody knew his face. And he had taken the shoes off because he feared they made him vulnerable, a target. He was frightened of being beaten and dispossessed, okay? As soon as the voice of Mr. Hillman was heard, the narrative on Facebook completely changed, okay? From a discourse around love, it turned to be a discourse around the undeserving poor. People started to question Mr. Hillman's action. Some comments read, "Soon after the bum sold the boots, he claims he has eaten them, sure buddy." And other comments said, "I see the homeless man now wants a piece of the pie that his image is creating. What a dick." And there are many, many of these other comments, okay? So as soon as Mr. Hillman speaks, and he tells us what he really thinks, he stops being the poor worth of care and love. What he says does not fit with the dominant framing. We are not supposed to hear his voice. That is not how we care. And so he becomes undeserving, a fraud. What this story shows, I hope, is that our encounter with homelessness is always partial. Our responses are overlaid with layers of normative social narratives, like charitable attitudes or racialized and classist judgments that de facto are limiting our understanding of the whole issue. And these kinds of a priori responses, like the one that we just saw on Facebook, are not limited to Facebook only, but they are the foundation of policy and scholarship too. The central issue is that people are trying to solve the homelessness problem without inquiring about the personal, lived experience of the homeless themselves. So I think that at this point, we need to get out of our comfort zone and start to reconsider homelessness from a completely different angle, from a new starting point. And this brings me to my second point, which is related to the ways in which we think about home. So in my work, I argue that the problem with homelessness is that it is defined as the negation of home, conceptually and practically. The less, in the word homeless, signals a lack, the absence of shelter, financial stability, ontological security, and so on. Home is supposed to be the opposite of this lack, a plenitude made of shelter, financial stability, and ontological security. But I believe we need to question this binary. We need to ask why home is something that has the potential to becoming a lack, why it has the potential of being eradicated, why it can be displaced. To do this, we must look at the precarity that structures both of these concepts together, home and homelessness, because both are founded on the same kind of affective foundation, on the same embodied form of precarity. This is a condition that is perceived by everyone, but at different level of intensities. A rough sleeper is affected by precarity in ways that we cannot imagine. I cannot imagine that. Our bodies are not exposed to the same degree of privation. But this does not mean that we are different in kind or outside of the same kind of precarious game. We are also subject to housing precarity in less intense forms. The burden of debt that results from the financialization of housing, the normalization of eviction, the trauma of living in violent households, these are all forms of precarity that affect people who are not technically homeless in the conventional framing. Precarity, this is what I'm arguing, is the precondition of being at home in the contemporary urban West and possibly beyond. So even if you are at home, you are still in a precarious form of living. And why has this happened? In part because home is constructed around an exclusionary act. Home is made of walls and doors which create control and allow for a policing of a border. Home is made of social relationships based around usually emotional bonding, which are carved out through exclusion. There is no bonding if there is no exclusion of others. Home is constructed in its material form by accumulation of capital, accumulation that emerges from, as we already heard, system and reproduces system of oppressions. And home is structured by internal kind of exclusion, unbalanced gender power relationships and paternalistic mode of being. In other words, our lovely home is grounded in multiple forms of exclusions. It is rooted in precarity. So the fictional distinction between the normal home and the pathological state of homelessness is a bordering tool. It's just a fiction. It creates the other, l'autre, the deviant other, a passive subject of study and care. It disguises the fact that actually we are not very different from Paolo or Mr. Jeffrey Hillman. And I don't mean that in the soft humanitarian sense of a shared underlying humanity that persists in spite of difference. I mean that we are actually not very far removed. The same forces that make Paolo homeless affect all of us too. The difference is one of intensity, not one of kind. We are all under the same kind of pressure, under threat from the same kind of forces, as the contemporary housing crises are showing. So the question for me is not how to help Paolo or Mr. Hillman. The question is more simple, yet profound. How can we think of ending homelessness without ending this kind of precarious home? There is no way of ending homelessness without challenging the way in which we construct our way of being into the world, into home. So I think that we need to challenge both the economy of homelessness, the knowledge economy, but also the specific ways that home is defined in a binary with its lack. But what do we do to replace this kind of conventional understandings? And here I go to my last point, which is we need to start from below. We need to look at life at the margins. So, as Bell Hooks argued, the margins are neither a place nor a category to define a group. Instead, the margins are a site of tension at politics, the margins are a site of resistance. Here, people have already developed a practical and effective challenge to precarity because they had to. Here, people are dwelling in ways that break open the habitual status quo. And this is not about romanticizing poverty and its enduring trauma. This is about taking that trauma seriously as something from which something else emerges, as something that has its own ways of articulating its own liberation. So it doesn't need somebody else. It articulates its own liberation. And I'm giving you 2 brief examples about this. In a recent essay, Sahita Harman tells the story of Esther Brown. Esther is a young black woman living in Harlem at the time of World War I, and here I'm quoting, who hated to work, the condition of work, as much as the very idea of work. End of quote. And I kind of agree with that. So Esther resists the discipline and pressures of everyday life by strolling in the open. Okay? In describing her walking, this kind of walking, Harman tells us that the ways in which bodies move is more than simple coming and going. In her movement, Esther constructs a differential modality of being. Conventionally, she would be defined as homeless or vagrant, but in reality, she is contesting the dominant habitus, challenging the demand that her body stays still, gets out of the way of white people. So the wandering and drifting of Esther, which was without organization, without declared politics, and without recognition, is not just an embodiment of precarity, but a precarious political form of embodiment. The body of Esther Brown was not supposed to move in the way it does. In walking, she traces a ritornello, a refrain of being, which cuts through habitual racialized segregation and displacement in the US city. By walking, she does what Mr. Hillman does by factually refusing the charity of the police officer. She is resisting her own normalization. She is resisting to be contained as homeless. She is showing that for her, as a young black woman in Harlem, another way of being into the world, another home, is possible. A second example, this comes from my own fieldwork in Bucharest. A community of people living underground, a few meters away from the main train station of Bucharest, showed me the ways that radical dwelling could be woven, if you want, into the fabric of an apparently homeless existence. They lived in the tunnels of Bucharest's heating system, a space which they called casa, home, without a shred of irony. This home was an assemblage of circulation, of bodies, of drugs, of materials for recycling, which they sorted and sold in the informal markets of the city. They were very well organized. They had electricity, light, TV, a stereo, and a kitchen where they cooked communal meals. And we are talking about 30 or 40 people who lived together in this way for more than 20 years, carving out a resistance space in a world that did not have any space for them. Conventional wisdom says that these people pose a problem to be solved. The homeless need to be institutionalized. The drug users need to be cured. The urban hustlers need to be restrained. But in the underground, a radical affirmation of difference was possible. An alternative true and an alternative home was proposed. Ileana, a woman of the community, explained this to me as she washed the collective dishes in a bucket 3 meters below the surface of the road. She said, "It's a very good life here. We have food and warmth, and we have everything we need. No one is left behind to watch the others eating. We are eating together. We are like a family." So this kind of infrastructure of care, if you want, points to something more profound, more radical than just resilience. Okay, this is not just resilience. The community had rearranged the status quo to sustain life in their own terms. I met people who had lived in the underground for more than 15 years. They dreamt and loved there, fought and died there, harassed each other, but also cared for each other in ways that would have been impossible in one of the city's homeless shelters. Just as Esther Brown resisted through scrolling, the community of Gara de Nord refused to fit and instead proposed a different kind of home. They dwelt in and through the margins via horizontal kind of alliances, by constructing a community. By taking this as a serious form of resistance, we can recognize the limitation of existing economy of homelessness and challenge the precarity sitting at the heart of our idea of home. Essentially, the point that I'm trying to make is that our idea of home is just one possibility out of many. It is from that possibility, because of its exclusionary kind of foundation, that most of our problems in terms of what we call homelessness arise. What we need is not another policy to bring people back to that kind of home, but a collective effort to construct a different home, learning from those who are already there, like my friends in Bucharest, to do so. So Paolo passed away in September 2015. His last post on Facebook was a shot of a sunset taken from his hospital room. The text was a simple buonanotte. We spoke for the last time on the phone a few days before. The traces that remain of his life, and many others like it, are fragile and ephemeral. But those traces, more often than not, point in the right direction. This is just a jet lag. And that direction is all about moving away from our current home. It is about moving outside of established narratives by being attentive to capitalized and racialized histories, and by listening to alternative forms of living and breathing resistance that we can rebuild home. So we won't be able to tackle homelessness if we don't reinvent the ways in which we are looking at the issue. I'm not the only one working in this sense, of course. As others are saying, we need to move the horizon of homelessness and housing politics to allow people to make plans for themselves. And as I have showed, for me, this requires at least three things. We need to challenge the truth of homelessness, we need to question the framings of home, and we need to learn from the uncanny politics of the urban margins. So in a sense, we need to get closer to housing precarity, to the place where it is lived and felt, and then feel its political orientation and sustain its radical subversive politics without reservation. Thank you.
I have all these amazingly insightful questions that I've prepared, but I've also already been able to talk to everybody on this panel. And so I think we'll just open it up, since the night is no longer young, to you. Any of you have questions for the panel as a whole, for individuals?
We answered all questions.
No questions left. Yeah.
My name? Michele.
Your idea of homelessness reminded me of how I try to address the issue of homelessness to friends who are not involved in this field. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and so for me, when people say like, oh, you know, the example that people tend to give me is like, I went to a party and I gave someone a meal and the person didn't want it. And so to me, it makes me think that the person giving is already making assumptions about what the other person needs. So if the person's not in the field of eating food, he's going to reject that because he's not in that time frame. But people feel like, oh, he's like, he's not considerate. He's like all that stuff. But for me, it's like.
Turn it off, I think. Turn it back on. Turn it back on. No, it's not on.
But I appreciate what you were saying about the homeless, because my point is like, for me, when I try to address it for people who don't understand, is like I give the example of a teacher. If you're passionate about the work that you do, when you go to a classroom, you are at home because you're in you want to educate the kids and whatnot. But when you're out of the classroom, you feel a sense of emptiness, sense of less. If you're an artist, the stage is your home. But when you're not performing, there's a sense of lessness. So homelessness is a spiritual aspect too. So there's the physical homeless, but there's also the spiritual element. And it reminded me of how I guess you were trying to convey that, about like, it's not just the physical aspect of home, but every single one of us have been homeless, because there's been moments in our lives that we are not quote unquote home, where we, as parents, when parents are not with their kids, you miss your kids. So there's a sense of lessness. And when you arrive home and the kid gives you a hug, that is your home. So when we come to understand that we have all experienced levels of homelessness, that can also bring us to a sense of kinship, that we can all meet. You know how you said the roads meet and the frustration you want us to get there? I think that's the part. And for me, the challenge is that let us meet at the intersection of kinship. And when we meet in the intersection of kinship, we will be more empathetic to the people experiencing homelessness.
Thank you very much. This actually, to pivot it to a question to all of you, and maybe you have some specific responses also, but I wanted to ask about that language aspect of the word homelessness. It's something that comes up in every presentation, really, the definitions and the parameters and the terminology that we use. You're talking about how academic discourse it silences and contains measures too often, and how do we move beyond that? And maybe it's through moving outside of established narratives, as you suggested. And I mean, you were telling me yesterday there are more terms for homelessness in German, which is really, it changes the conversation as well. And then yesterday you told me that you want to obliterate the term homelessness. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about those terms.
He asked you first. So.
All right. I'll just say one thing. And the thing is, so there's some of us are more affected by the intensities of living in precarious housing conditions because of certain structural inequalities, of which Ananya and others in the panel have discussed. And these are related to essentially the kind of capitalist societies and racialized societies in which we live. And these things are there. But no one sits outside of that precarity. Everybody is part of it. And so we create a fiction when we say, I am at home, you are not at home. That is just a fiction, and it's a fiction that allows me actually to do my job and allows a civil servant to do his job, a police officer to do his job. But it's just a fiction, because in factual terms, I am under the threat of precarious housing conditions as well. I really am. Everybody is, because of the ways in which this society works. So I think the first step, to go back to the terminology, is just to accept the fact that homelessness does not sit outside of home. Homelessness is part of the home that we constructed, because we constructed a home that allows for its negation. We have a society in which we can still say that we are at home while having people that are not at home. You see what I'm trying to say? It's part of the same thing, ontologically.
As far as within my lifestyle, like I said earlier, being young and realizing that I had at times had to stay with grandma, I had to stay with my auntie, and then running into the fact of, like I said, I first came to Skid Row to sell drugs, and at that point I stayed out 3 nights in a row in the same area, and I claimed the area so hard. So to then run into the false incarceration, and now I wanted to know, was I a hypocrite? Because for so long I spoke on the word of, hey, they're not bums, they're not homeless, it's my people, that's where I'm from. But at that time I'm speaking from an organizer, person in the office. I'm not actually in the condition, not realizing at the same time I didn't own the home that I was in. that I'm struggling to keep, you know? So when the condition ends up hitting me, I had to realize, was I going to be a hypocrite to realize that I said, the people that I so-called say help me and that I'm learning from, am I better than them? And I had to realize that no, I consider them just being as great as I am, regardless of the position that I look at them in, and I can do it in a tent. I actually, you know, I mean, instead of saying I now need to go, you know, couch surf and take myself out of this condition to start rat racing again in this condition that I'll end up running into again, because that's why I initially came to Skid Row. I came to Skid Row because I couldn't figure out how to pay my bills, so I started selling drugs to make sure I could live. And to continue to do that at 42, or when I first started to say, okay, I'm not doing that anymore, which was 36, would have been, it would have baffled me to not let this wound heal. You know, I sooner or later considered I needed to keep the Band-Aid off so that it could get sun. Because if I kept covering it up, I was just going to keep not letting it heal, and it was going to get infected, and then I wasn't going to figure out how to actually get it done. But if I actually exposed that it was there, people were, well, you know what, I know I have something for that, you know, and then I could actually get the help that I've always looked for to figure out how to actually accomplish what I needed to. And that made me sooner or later figure out that homelessness was a condition that you put on yourself to feel whole or to feel that you're competing. And that's what the shirt, you know, and it just felt so perfect that we spoke in the order that we did, because it seemed like it went in a certain order. Home is where the heart is. You know, it's like a turtle. You know, a turtle travels, but at any time it can go inside. You know, you have an inner voice that you listen to at one point that no one hears, but you still hear that sound wave broken even though you don't open your mouth. And that's who you are inside, and that's that inside. Once we can realize who we are inside, then it allows you to see the next person as being just as whole as you are. So yeah, that's where my mind's at.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important one. So we've already heard from Crushow and Michele about why one can be unsheltered or unhoused and still have a very strong sense of home. So the language I've been using, taking a cue from housing justice movements, is of the unhoused rather than the homeless, because we want to point to the systematic unhousing of people and the various forms of dispossession and displacement that make up unhousing. And it sort of puts a certain responsibility on structures of government that unhouse people. But the second is, I noted that I grew up in India, and a lot of my research has been in India, but also in other parts of the global south, in the Middle East. And in particular, in the languages that I grew up with, Bengali and Hindi, there is no word that is equivalent to homeless or even unhoused. There are, of course, words for home, words for shelter, but instead what we have are perhaps 50 different terms for the different ways in which the unhoused house themselves, for the many forms of shelter. Terms for pavement dwelling, terms for different kinds of squatting, terms for different kinds of slums. And the moment I translate these terms into English, you see how I'm flattening this out into terms that are deeply stigmatized. So years ago, when I moved to the United States after completing high school in India, and I took up urban studies, I was absolutely shocked at the ways in which the Anglophone world, and particularly the United States, stigmatizes and labels and names. And it continues to be quite disjunctural in that it does not line up with how many parts of the world allow people to imagine home and shelter.
Well, working here. whatever. Actually, I think that unhousing terminology is really a good one, and I think it might match what we call Wohnungslosigkeit, the being without a house in German, and the other word would be the unsheltered, Obdachlosigkeit. So it differentiates exactly between that, and it's not referring to the home, which is, I think, well, actually, I think that to challenge your position or the one, I think we shouldn't talk about everybody being confronted with being homeless in the term of houselessness or unhoused, because I think there's, of course, huge differences how we all are confronted with the danger of being unhoused. And as I showed before, if looking to the German numbers, there are people who really are not confronted with the danger of being unhoused. But the problem is that the number of those who are being confronted with it actually keeps increasing, and we see an increasing number who actually do these kinds of irregular housing situations, like living with their aunties or living with their parents, even though they are grown up and wouldn't want to do that. So I think that's very important to be precise in what we are actually talking about, and not saying, okay, we are all in the same situation and all kind of being confronted with homelessness. But I think we can get out of that problem, that tricky situation, if we use those words, the unhoused, and talk about this kind of terminology, use that kind of terminology. I think that's matching very much, working very, very well.
Should we ask for another question? Does anybody else have something they'd like to pose to any individual or the group? Well, I mean, oh yes.
What was the one thing that helped you get off the streets the most? Anybody that was not living on the streets, what helped you the most? Was it a person, was it an organization, was it yourself? What gave you the strength to change your life?
Well, my son, my kids, you know, if I didn't have my kids, I'd probably still be the biggest dope dealer downtown LA. Because I realize, you know, at sometimes when I wake up, I realize that my kid's still going to be marching in 20 years. Because it's going to be a bunch of these meetings going on like this, and then people are going to go home. And, you know, go about their lives and figure out how to do things later. But me having my kid made me realize that I can't live for those that I'm facing. I have to set a different boundary for my son, because the problem I ran into was father wasn't there for me to talk to. I didn't trust anyone to understand who I was to tell me it was going to work, whatever they thought was going to work. But at the same time, my little brother saved my life, because I ended up calling my little brother one day when I thought I had it all planned out, because, you know, I had my kids and now I'm on this black and proud thing, you know, this color, this still division, separation deal, you know, really being on this racist deal. Because to hold on to any, you know, black, white, you must be a fool, because I went to college and I had biology with a lab and it wasn't nowhere in biology. So I held on to something that was keeping me black and that was keeping me from growing, because I didn't want to break out of what people considered from my culture that I didn't want to be. You know, I didn't want to be from it. And it wasn't that, but that's what condemned me. That's what had me back. So when I spoke to my little brother and he told me I had to run my race, he told me I had to run my race, because I asked him, did he know where we were from? And he made the statement that he knew where he was from, speaking, he's a Jehovah's Witness. So he was speaking that he knew who made him. And my first thing was like, oh, no, man, what do you mean? That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, do you want to know what island, you know, how we got here And he he laughed over the phone, and he was like, why would I start there when I'm trying to start from the beginning? You asked me where I was from, and I know where I'm from. And I'm not going to let man tell me where I'm from. And that gave me wholeness again. That gave me to where I wasn't competing anymore. I didn't want to compete anymore. You know, I was 36 years old. Like I said, the wound needed to be seen, that I was a college guy, played ball, and had been supported all the way through my journey, and now ran into the no support. And the only thing I could think of was drugs. So for my brother to tell me that and tell me to actually just run my race, and that God put me here for a purpose, and for me to actually run that race, and once I finish that race, I have no more races to run. It set me on a different path to where I wasn't competing with you guys anymore. What was said and what was put in front of me, the carrots, you know, they take the infinity sign and they cut it with 2 carrots, and they make you chase those 2 carrots, you know, and they cut it off at the top so it stops coming to the bottom, and all I can get was what they kick out. You get what I mean? So once I realized that it was designed, I didn't want to play anymore, you know. But one thing I have realized with that is I still must stay positive in my step, because even though I do that, I'm fighting another charge right now from just being pointed out, as my partner is saying, just for being who I am, not looking the way I need to look, to where someone can say, hey, he robbed me, and I have a witness. To where now, whatever money I've made to put myself in the position to not have the tent that I have, it's went $150,000 for bail money, you know? And if you don't have that, then, you know, that means basically I have to take the deal, and, you know, I'm screwed, you know? So I have to use my money that I've to stay out of jail, you know? And who knows how many other people have that problem. I'm just fortunate enough that I actually make the right moves in my race to have support, you know? But what about those that aren't trying to show that they're wounded, you know? So for me, it was me just basically talking to my brother and having my kid that made me realize that I'm not in this race anymore, and it's worked for me not to compete.
Congratulations. Because when you let go of the blame and the pain and the shame, then you free yourself. Otherwise, you forever cage yourself in rage, and you become a songbird that can't sing anymore. All you do is scream. So thank you so much for changing your life, because you're changing so many other people's lives. So I really give you kudos. You have my love. We're changing each other, brother. Come together.
Yeah, right here.
I want to thank everyone first for the ways in which the discussion is ranging from, you know, the deeply local and deeply personal, and even to the point of, you know, naming names and like I'm trying to unseat some of the names that we name things. I'm kind of interested in this difference of scale, going from global financialization and then also thinking about infrastructural politics and policies and definitions of what infrastructure might mean in terms of this other option for thinking about a socialization. I think maybe it's another way of talking about a socialization of housing, but the scales I'm really interested in really do range from, on the one hand, community-generated solutions to problems in specific locations, but then trying to match that up with how people are working on the large frame, right, of global financialization. Like, how do you actually, I understand a principle of working at both levels. Where does it meet? In other words, how do you connect the global financialization with the ways in which, at a community level, there's activism going on? I know all of you have been thinking about this and working this in your practice. I just wonder if maybe you can help me kind of bridge a little bit of that scale, like to go from the community level to go to the global financialization question, or even in between, thinking about how we actually resist these really long-term centuries of conquest and colonization that deploy these forms of state violence, right? How do we, are there any little lessons or something that we can take? And I don't want to say, like, what do we do when we go home? But rather just to think somewhere along this scale, even just one or two thoughts from different folks.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, Actually, I don't think it's that hard to link it, but might be wrong. I mean, of course, you're saying, you're completely right, the scales are from the community organizing and even from the individual to infrastructural politics or global financialization. Well, I think the first thing to notice is that it's important to realize that there are structures at work that affect everything. I mean, they affect personal life, but they affect the structure, the way how we think about housing and how welfare states are organized or welfare is organized. That's all structured to one specific logic of how housing is thought and how infrastructural politics is thought, and that, well, it's basically organized along logics of capitalism. But then tackling those things from the perspective of research or the perspective of housing policies or policies doesn't exclude the idea of accepting how people actually feel when they live the way they live and, well, getting rid of normative ideas how people should live, which is, I think, a very important thing. But it doesn't mean that it's, on the other hand, not right to fight for or to research and fight for, well, justice for everybody. Because justice, in that point, means, from my perspective at least, that people should have the right to decide by themselves how they want to live. And that, of course, also means having at least the option to finding a home or a house. So that's one thing that I think is important if you try to link these different scales and levels. And then thinking from an, well, my perspective as urban planner and urban researcher, it's also important to understand that these different fields of policies, urban development policy, urban planning and design, national policies, and, for example, the regulation of global financial capital actually are spheres that we need to understand in their relationship and how they work with each other. And so that's why I think it's very important to actually look how are these things working and in the neighborhoods, and how are they changing people's lives on the street and in the neighborhoods, and then trying to understand how this happens. How do urban politics change, and what does this have to do with national politics, with welfare politics? So these are not fields that are separated. And we need to try to understand that these things are related. And so that's, I think, exactly the point, trying to look at the different scales.
So I would say that the housing justice movements that I admire, say just in California, are often fighting for housing justice case by case. They're fighting for this eviction by eviction. They're fighting for this municipal ordinance by ordinance. But they're also acutely aware of how a single case embodies these structures that we're talking about today. And I think that the housing justice movements can be very creative in putting a human face on those structures. So I talked earlier about the work of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which for me is this amazing data collection, data visualization, storytelling collective run by a brilliant group of women, some of whom work closely with Michele on the Radical Housing Journal. And they, along with the movements in New York, have been doing this incredible thing on serial evictors. So if you go to their website, they name and shame the landlords who have been initiating the largest number of evictions and everything from Oakland to New York, many of which, right, so what they've been doing is saying, here is a LLC, a limited liability corporation, that owns a building that has been undertaking evictions, but we, through research, have now figured out that this LLC is connected to 30 other LLCs, all owned by the same person or financial entity. And we are going to show to you how all of these seemingly disparate evictions are connected to one another through the same entity, right? We'll name and shame these evictors. So there's fantastic stuff on these top evictors. And then what groups like the LA Tenants Union and DSA LA, right? There might be some UCLA graduate students involved in all of this, right? They will literally show up at the homes of those that they've been able to put a human face on and shame them in front of their neighbors, right? So there is a lot of humanizing of structures of inequality that is possible and that movements are doing all the time. And I just want to say one other thing in thinking about the Berlin case, which is very much on my mind. I think part of this then is thinking about who owns what they supposedly own. So I talked about how the unhoused are constantly illegalized. But I think we've got to think about the illegalities of wealth accumulation. And the ways in which, so I talked earlier about how Blackstone and other Wall Street entities are buying up foreclosed homes, turning them into very profitable rental housing, now securitizing this. So it's similar to the selling off of municipal housing in Berlin. Why were those foreclosed homes not already in public ownership when there was a massive bailout using our taxpayer money of big banks and no bailout of homeowners? That anyway should be public property. That anyway should be in public ownership, right? So maybe we need to adopt that slogan of give back our homes, right? And the many ways in which we can therefore, again, humanize these structures of inequality and financialization in particular.
Now, I just want to make an example which is related to what Ananya just said. In Spain, at the peak of the financial and housing crisis, you had the creation of this movement from below, which is la Plataforma de Afectado de la Hipoteca, which means the platform of the people affected by the mortgages. And that particular movement started as a local concern, okay? So you had 5 people meeting in a room and sharing their stories of eviction. And then you had other 5 coming into the room, sharing their stories, creating horizontal solidarities, creating the idea that it's possible to have a different ways of being at home. And then eventually, through organizing, through horizontal organizing, so not talking about vertical structures, okay, no, horizontal organizing, you had the leader of that movement becoming the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau. So there are possibilities of change in which you can connect the micro with what we believe sits on top. I don't believe on that vertical understanding of these things. These things are all horizontal. There are just different degrees of distance. And of course, different degrees of distance and power. But through collective organizing and horizontal solidarities, you can achieve change also at the level of what we believe is a vertical structure. And I think the case of Ada Colau in Barcelona is an example, but there are others around the world. So it's just to throw it there because it really speaks to what you were saying.
Agree. My thing is, like I was saying earlier, I feel it has to start from the bottom. And when you start from the bottom, that means you have the people. If you can get the people, then you have the numbers. And then from the numbers, you as a whole can decide what's the next move. You know, Without Shelter is done as a whole for us to decide what the next move is. And within the month, we're moving. But it's working as a whole. It's not just the guy with the master's or the guy that has the BA that's in the tent. It's the guy that has whatever other qualifications that we have. We have Maurice that has his qualifications of 7 languages. We have the city of Long Beach behind another rep. You know, it's what all comes to the table. One of our reps says gumbo. You know, you have to bring it all in for everybody to get a piece, to know how it's made out. And from the bottom is the only way you can get it. And if you get the people behind it, they'll put who they want in front and who they're behind. The problem is we're always trying to get satisfaction from the top. But if you don't look for satisfaction at the top, then you're going to get it from who's going to give it to you when it's your time. You know? And that's where the problem ends up happening. It's like being in class and you're constantly looking at the clock, wanting to know when you're going to get out of class. But if you just do the work and you get the people behind you, pretty soon the bell rings and you're like, oh, damn, it's time to go, you know? So that's what ends up happening. If you can just start from the bottom and really figure out what do the people want. Like, okay, what do the renters want? And if the renters can decide that we don't want people not being in our position, having the problems we're having, we want to make sure there's equal rights for everyone else to be able to do it, then some people tend to step down from where they're at. Like, I mean, I'm not an artist trying to make the money off of my art. I'm an artist trying to make money for people. So, I mean, that's what needs to happen. The people that are in the position, the problem isn't that you're fortunate. The problem is you're not doing anything with your fortune, that you're privileged. Like, you have the superpower to end this, and we just keep going home and turning on TV, not ending it. Like, what is the ending cause? What are we doing when we leave here? And it does matter what you're doing when you leave here, because it's non-ending. Like, while you're sleeping, somebody's figuring out where they want to sleep, you know? So it never stops. So I can't go home to my tent, or I can't, I have 2 kids that's waiting for me to come home, but they know I have a purpose, or I'm not going to be blessed with my next journey. Everything that's coming to me is being handed to me because I'm putting myself in someone else's position and realizing that it exists. So with that, I'm actually being blessed to run into someone else that wishes to help the next position that I'm going to step into. And I think that's what's actually needing to happen. We need to start from the bottom and start realizing that the next person's human, and put yourself in their position and realize that your door can't close yet because you still have more to do. And if that happens, things will tend to change because we'll come together and stop looking up top, and they'll have to change the infrastructure. Because even if we do get it from up top, it's still, the infrastructure is bad. It's tore up. And we're not changing the infrastructure, but we're constantly looking up that way to do it. But if we keep creating grassroots-wise, we'll change the infrastructure, and they'll have to use what's available because the people say that's what it is. I feel that.
Thank you. It's time for food and music. So, thank you all.